Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another wonderful biology lecture. Today we're going to be looking at evidence of evolution. So today's guiding question is, how does the fossil record, morphology, biochemistry, and adaptations provide evidence of evolution? It's a good question. I think we'll go with it. New vocabulary for today include derived trait, ancestral trait, homologous structures, vestibular structures, analogous structures, biogeography, fitness, camouflage, and mimicry. All great things, so let's go ahead and dig on in. The review vocabulary for today is fossil, which is the remains of something that lived, usually in sandstone or in sedimentary rock, that shows evidence that a organism had lived there. Okay, so the theory of evolution states that all organisms on Earth have descended from a single ancestor. And see, when I've talked about the definition of the word evolution, this is oftentimes what people are referring to, the theory of evolution, when they say just evolution. And this includes the origin of all life on Earth, as opposed to a more narrow interpretation, which would be just change over time. So recall that theories provide explanations for natural phenomenon based on observation. Okay, that's just a general definition of what a theory is. Usually, theories are not as firmly trusted or understood as, say, a law, like the law of gravitational motion, the law of increasing entropy, et cetera, et cetera. So the laws of physics, theories still have room to be improved because they're not necessarily complete. And I think that's probably the case for the theory of evolution. It's missing something, and we'll talk about that again next unit. So Darwin's On the Origin of the Species demonstrated how evolution could be used to explain all life on Earth, or at least that's what he thought. And so his primary mechanism that he proposed was natural selection. But natural selection alone didn't necessarily explain everything, which is why our understanding of the theory of evolution has, well, itself evolved quite a bit over time and still probably has quite a bit of evolving to do yet. So evidence for evolution can be found from the fossil record, because it looks like life started out complex and became more complex over time. Comparative anatomy, because it looks like some characteristics can be shown to be shared by multiple organisms, and perhaps they came from a common ancestor. Vestibular structures, which is the loss of function, so a structure that did something previously and then no longer does that thing. Comparative embryology. This is actually not a good source for evidence for evolution, according to Stephen Jay Gould, and I agree with him that it's rather misleading in the way it's oftentimes presented. So probably we'll talk about it, but I will bring this topic up in the next unit because it's poorly implemented in most cases. We'll see what this book does. Comparative molecular biology, and finally, geographic distribution. All of these are used to support the theory of evolution. So the fossil record. All right, so according to the book, the fossil record shows modern species, which resemble ancient species. In fact, that's an interesting topic. There are things called living fossils where you have, for example, the comb jellyfish that existed some 90 plus million years ago and is basically identical to what it was in the fossil record today. It hasn't actually evolved or changed over time. So while this does show some evidence for evolution, it can also be used to show evidence of what's called stasis, or staying the same. So if you're willing to pick and choose your evidence, this is great. They reveal that some species have changed very little, like the comb jellyfish, and some have changed tremendously, or at least we think so. And the fossil records is an important source of information for determining the ancestry in the distant past. Now, the problem with the fossil record, and I think everyone can just sit back and agree with that, is it's woefully incomplete. Um, Again, somewhere between 1 and 5% of all organisms that have ever lived managed to get fossilized, and of those 1 to 5%, we've only uncovered a very, very small fraction of that. So, will we have a complete picture of how life developed on Earth? No, we never will. It's not ever going to exist. We're going to be using a lot of assumptions and a lot of principles, like the principle of parsimony, which is the simplest explanation is the best one. Things like this are going to be used pretty heavily, and rightly so. But you, as a student, should keep in mind that the evidence from the fossil record is scant, because the fossil record itself is like a puzzle piece that has 10 pieces out of 100,000, right? It's like you drawing solid conclusions from the fossil record is not only a bad idea, it's a very foolish idea. So, other than things like we predict that there should be an intermediate between dinosaurs and birds that looks kind of like a dinosaur and kind of like a bird. Oh, we found one, it's called Archaeopteryx. That seems to lend credence to our theory. And that's nice, it's very anecdotal and beautiful and fits very well, but it's not conclusive. I hope you understand the difference there. The same thing with the whales, right? We should have a land mammal that is somewhere between aquatic mammals and land mammals. And oh, we've kind of found one. This looks like it might fit here. Did it actually fit there? Is it actually an intermediate form? We have no way of knowing, right? They assume that it is because it fits well, but that doesn't bear on the reality of it ever actually having been related. It could have been a dead evolutionary pathway and not given rise to anything. And how do we know? We don't. And that's the point here. When we're looking at the fossil record, it supports the theory of evolution because the theory of evolution is assumed to be true. And the evidence is arranged to support the theory. And that's well and good. And there are some predictions that the theory has made that have flushed out in terms of intermediate forms. But the reality is there's so many intermediate forms missing that could be coincidental and not really supporting of anything. So take it for what it's worth. I'll let you read the book on this. It's much more bullish on the prospect of the fossil record supporting evolution than I am, obviously. But at the same time, I want to be completely forthright and honest with you in terms of what I understand to be true. And I would never make a case based on such a fragmented piece of evidence as the fossil record. Now, here the book talks about Archaeopteryx, and I mentioned this thought to be transitional form already. An interesting thing about Archaeopteryx is birds have been found in the fossil record that predate the Archaeopteryx fossil. So Archaeopteryx was around after birds had already evolved. Does that mean that a unfossilized version of an Archaeopteryx-like dinosaur did not exist prior to that could have evolved into birds? No, it doesn't mean that at all. It means that Archaeopteryx as the transitional form between dinosaurs and birds doesn't cut it because it was not old enough to be around when the birds evolved. So interesting things like that are found constantly in paleontology, where a proposed organism like Archaeopteryx fits the criteria. It should be about this layer of strata, it should be this type of organism, and it should be an intermediate. And it seems to, but then further research finds, oh no, there were some bird species before Archaeopteryx, so it can't be the transitional form. That has proven out more times than not the longer I've been alive. For me, it was the Coelinthecynth, which was the Lobed fin fish, that was the transitional form between aquatic fish and land walking reptiles. It turns out that the coelacanth is a deep sea fish. It uses those very large fins to ride on hydrothermal vents in the lower ocean and would have never gone anywhere near land. So when you're talking about the fossil record, again, people are making a lot of assumptions, and that's not good science, right? The evidence should lead the theory, not the theory lead the evidence. And when you're looking at the fossil record and a lot of the assertions that are made from the fossil record, it's really the theory leading the evidence and leading how you interpret the evidence. Now, comparative anatomy is probably a better piece of evidence to look at when you're looking at common ancestry, because you can see in groups of animals that they have similar biological structures, whether it be their skeletons or their brains. For humans, if we're looking at other primates, there are some similarities there. And what are called homologous structures, which are structures that are similar because of ancestry, can be found, right? And so all mammals, interestingly, have the same number of arm bones. They both have a radius and an ulna and a humerus. Now, the lynx can be drastically different in all mammals, but they all have those 3 arm bones. Same thing for the number of phalanges, or fingers, digits on the extremities. Like a bat has the same number of phalanges as a human would. It's just they're longer and shaped in the shape of a wing, right? But the bones are homologous structures, used very, very differently, but still very similar. Now, vestibular structures are something I don't think anyone has any real problem with. I don't think anybody would say that mutation can't break something and make it less useful, and therefore it gets discarded over time. In fact, most of evolution probably occurs in this fashion, right? Where a structure had function in the past, that function is no longer useful, and so that function is then, or that structure is thereby deleted now that the function is no longer useful. And so vestibular structures are probably real. Like, I have no problem with the idea of vestibular structures. The only problem is that we keep finding functions for things that we thought were vestibular. So, for example, when I was a child in the 1980s and 90s, the tonsils and the adenoids, which are part of your endocrine system, part of your lymphatic system in your body, they have a lot of white blood cells, and they help the body in its immune defense from respiratory illnesses, right? So your upper sinus cavities and your throat, you get a lot of sinus and throat infections as you're going through life. And the tonsils and adenoids actually help defend your body from infection. Well, when I was a kid, they were still removing tonsils and adenoids because they thought they were vestibular structures. And even though it was infrequent, this led to some serious infections that the body was unable to fight off in people who had them removed. So those structures are still very useful. Other structures that are sometimes cited are things like the tailbone in humans. I don't know that I would call that a vestibular structure, because all of your muscles for your butt closing are attached to that. And if you removed that bone from the body, you would become incontinent, meaning that you would defecate on yourself uncontrollably. You wouldn't be able to hold any of your poop in. And so, yeah, I think it's very useful and good to have around. I'd like to keep my tailbone, but if there are people out there who think it's vestibular structure, I'm happy to, let them remove it and show us how useless it really is. Now, analogous structures is something that's interesting and doesn't actually support the theory of evolution or detract from it. It's kind of an observation that's been made. And that is that some structures, like the wing in a bat and the wing in a bird, look very, very similar, but they are not at all related. Okay? Now, why is this important? Why does this matter? When a scientist is attempting to, show a relationship between structures in organisms, sometimes telling the difference between what's analogous and what's homologous is not as easy as it might seem. So, being on the eye, keeping an eye out for an analogous versus a truly homologous structure is something that scientists have to do over time. But I think this is the best example, the bat wing and the bird wing. They look very similar in structure. If you look at the bone structures of the bat wing and the bone structure of a bird wing, very, very similar. Obviously, birds evolved from reptiles some X million years ago, is what's thought about. Bats evolved from a common ancestor with all mammals, some kind of rat species, after the extinction of the dinosaurs. And they perform the same function. So this is actually maybe an argument against the theory of evolution, because you have two structures evolving down very distant chemical biological pathways with basically the same structure. What's the likelihood of that happening? I would imagine it's pretty low, right? That evolution would stumble on the same answer more than once. And these homologous structures are not the only times in history or in life where that occurs. So perhaps we'll look at that some more. Mayhaps not, but just keep that in the back of your mind, because that's an interesting thought. Evolution is not guided by intelligence, or so it's thought. So how exactly does life solve the same problem, flight, more than once, if it's random? It's a fair question, I think. Now, comparative embryology basically tries to say that at a certain stage of development, the embryos all look pretty similar to each other, and then they differentiate out from there to their different structures or the different organisms. Well, the problem with this is that if you go to the very earliest stages of embryological development, your zygote stages and shortly thereafter, most organisms have very different embryos. They look structurally very, very different. Then they kind of converge to a point where they start looking similar again, and then they diverge back out to looking very, very dissimilar. Now, that they start out dissimilar, become similar, and then become dissimilar could be evidence for evolution, or it could be entirely innocuous and have nothing to do with it. I'm on the fence on this piece of evidence, don't really find it compelling. Some people have invested quite a bit of time into it and think it says a lot, but that's what the books, generally speaking, don't tell you. That a lot of the evidence that's used is carefully picked and chosen to support the argument. And if you look at the evidence as a whole, it really doesn't support the theory as much as it sounds at first. Now, comparative molecular biology is a very new kind of level of analysis, and it attempts to show through proteomics, the study of proteins, the study of DNA, the study of RNA, the similarities between organisms. And at first, it made some pretty bizarre findings. Like there was, I believe it was an Oxford professor who said that humans and bananas shared roughly 50% of their DNA. Well, that measurement was talking about only the protein coding sections of DNA, because total genome decoding at the time was very expensive. So bananas and humans produce something like 50% similar proteins. Well, that's interesting. That's fascinating, actually. And because all of life uses DNA as its core programming system, right? It's memory, basically, stored in DNA. That is used as evidence for common ancestry, right? Because maybe if things had evolved differently, you had an RNA organism only, you should have organisms that have only RNA without any DNA. But that's not the case. They all have DNA. And so whatever organism was the first in the past had to have had DNA, because there are no other life forms that are purely RNA derived organisms, right? They all have some type of DNA, except for viruses, but they don't meet all of the qualifications of life. They're obligate parasites. They must be parasitizing an organism to reproduce. they have to infect something. And if they're not, then they're technically just not alive. They're not undergoing any kind of biological activity. They're not doing any chemical catalyzation. It's just a rogue program that can be inserted that destroys a cell. It's a virus. So, aside from viruses, everything has DNA as its base structure, and they all have similar protein sets. Um, and so, the idea that they have similar protein sets, similar protein coding regions, similar types of DNA structures, all is used to support the idea that they are all, in essence, related to each other. And that's a great oversimplification, but for a ninth grade class, I can't really go too much more into it than that. Geographic distribution. Now, this is much more compelling to me. I've found this very interesting. So, for example, in Australia, your marsupials, that's those organisms that have pouches to carry their young, um, they are widely spread and they have a very high degree of diversity, right? You have koala bears, kangaroos, dingaroos, all kinds of fantastic mammal organisms. Everywhere else, you only have the opossum. And then you have what are called oviparous mammals, which are us, which give live birth. Okay, other than the opossum, that is the case for organisms on land, right? Our mammals on land. And so it looks like you had a pouched mammal radiation into Australia where it rapidly diversified and took over that continent. And because it was isolated from all of the other oviparous mammals, your marsupials were able to thrive in the absence of competition with your oviparous mammals. Everywhere else, the opossum was not able to thrive because the oviparous mammals took all of the resources and differentiated out into the various types of mammals that there are. So, what kind of adaptations occur? What kind of mutations are what gives rise to the things that can be selected, right? That brings us to the idea of fitness. Any adaptation that increases fitness, which is the ability of a organism to acquire food and reproduce, it has to reproduce or it's not an increase in fitness because the gene doesn't get passed on if it's not reproducing. So anything that increases the ability of an organism to survive so that it can thereby reproduce is an increase in fitness. And that can be selected for by natural selection, or so it's thought. And so anything that allows the organism to survive more is going to be an increase in fitness. Some examples are camouflage, right? And this is the ability of, say, a grasshopper to look like a blade of grass or to look like a leaf in the grass. And that's camouflage. It's hiding in with something. You have spiders who have color patterns that are very similar to the trees that they're found on. That would be camouflage. Mimicry, on the other hand, is when one organism is harmless, but it looks very similar to a organism that is not harmful at all. I'm sorry. Yeah, organism that is harmful, not harmful, looks like an organism that is very harmful. So there are some plant species that have berries that are very similar to poisonous berries. There are some insects that look like spiders, but they are not spiders. Okay, there are some flying species that look like wasps. They mimic the wasp, but they are not at all poisonous like a wasp is. Okay, and so that's the general idea with mimicry. It's where you have an organism that looks like something harmful, but is not itself harmful at all. And this occurs in fish, this occurs in plant species, insect species, etc. Reptiles, you see this in reptiles. There's a coral snake and a constrictor snake. The coral snake is very deadly. The other snake is not deadly at all. Anyway, we could get into that later if you want to know more. I feel like I'm taking up too much time here. All right, so consequences of adaptations. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. The main consequence of an adaptation is that the organism is able to get more resources and therefore be more successful in reproduction, or it is literally able to have more children, like the actual fertility or something is increased, and therefore the organism survives. Or, yeah, the organism survives and passes on its genes to the next generation. It's very important to remember that mutations or characteristics that rise that are not helpful can't get passed on, or selected for at least, so that nothing really comes of them. Nature selects aggressively against things that are harmful. And so deleterious genes don't tend to last very long in most populations. All right. If you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, I have some questions for you. Thank you for listening.